Welcome back again tonight, everybody, faithful followers of this series, a series in which we iron out the various issues that surround the topic of prophecy and the end times, or eschatology. For those who are new, perhaps you've come tonight for the first time, or only just recently you've started coming, we're taking a more or less thematic approach to the subject, as a line-by-line, chapter-by-chapter approach, as you might find in a normal commentary, is more confusing than helpful in the case of the book of Revelation because of the way it uses parallelism and chiasm. So it's better to unpick the apocalypse one parallel strand at a time, which is more or less one theme or aspect at a time. So although we said back in session 9 that this would be a two-part topic, it just so happened that it was such a large first part that I split it into two parts. And so part 1 became parts 1 and 2, and part 2 became this part 3. And part 3 will be long enough tonight. It's actually quite a long session with a lot of information, no videos, so a lot of attention required, but lots of interesting stuff to hear tonight. We're going to start off with reference to something called the little horn. And we've talked about the abomination of desolation and the man of sin and all these things, but within the prophecies of Daniel there is a series of visions of horns, and these are kings and authorities that rule the empires. And among the horns that Daniel sees in various of his visions, a little horn pops up at the very end, a very arrogant little horn, a proud little horn, which becomes strong and victorious and basically seems to be a figure of the end times emergence of the Antichrist. So this latter day evil king or kings who desecrate singularly or collectively Jerusalem's temple and boast against God is somehow related to the little horns we find in two other places in Daniel, Daniel chapter 7 and 8. While it's not clear that they are all one and the same horn across all cases, and that the king is the same as these horns, I think that if they're not the same, then they're all sort of independent strands that don't seem to lead anywhere. So if they are all the same, then they all seem to focus on the one and same event, and so we assume they are the same. And the evil king and the little horns all definitely seem to be characterized, one and all, by their blasphemies and boastfulness. They are speaking of high things. The same word blasphemy is also found in connection with the apocalyptic beast in Revelation 13. And that phrase is repeated 4 times in 3 verses. And that fourfold mention is not just random, it's significant because the blasphemy is therefore civilization-wide. 4 is the number denoting civilization. So let's have a look at those verses in Revelation 13. Revelation 13, verses 1 and 5 to 6 read, "The dragon stood on the shore of the sea, and I saw a beast coming out of the sea. It had 10 horns and 7 heads, with 10 crowns on its horns, and on each head a blasphemous name. The beast was given a mouth to utter proud words and blasphemies, and to exercise its authority for 42 months. It opens its mouth to blaspheme God, and to slander his name, and his dwelling place, and those who live in heaven." So for now we must take the time to study this little horn or horns and find out what it is, what the blasphemies that it speaks might be. What are the high things and blasphemies that the little horn speaks against the Most High? The following is the historicist line of interpretation which identifies the proud little horn that speaks proudly as the Vatican, and it sees its mouth as being the Pope. I'm sure this view must, at least in part, be correct, as it accounts for all of the missing history in our macrocosm. Historicists identify all of the following as blasphemies of the Pope. The Pope, first of all, claims to hold the rank of Christ on earth. Now, they portray Christ as deity within their doctrine, and therefore the Pope, if he holds the rank of Christ, also has the rank of deity on earth. This makes him the only true representative of the divine nature to be found on earth. All that the Pope speaks must be ratified in heaven. Because his voice is the voice of deity, even heaven must obey it. And this is a teaching taught in the Catholic Encyclopedia, volume 12, page 265. In other words, his is the voice of God on earth. Papal dictates reach to heaven. They reach across the earth, and they even reach into the underworld. The power of priests, bishops, archbishops, cardinals, and popes to absolve sins makes them effectively a class of gods. And we're thinking here of something the Jews used to believe, that only God could forgive sins. According to the Catholic doctrine anyway, only sins may absolve sin, which was originally stated in dogmatic canons and decrees and reaffirmed in the 1921 Catechism. I'm just going to throw a little thought in here that in that story where the man was lowered through the ceiling and he was crippled and Jesus told him his sins were forgiven, and the rabbis were so upset that he had said that he could forgive the man's sins, only God could do that, we often take that as a sort of way of saying that Jesus was proving there that he was equal to God. But in fact, that's a false reading entirely. What Jesus was saying is that it's everybody's prerogative and everybody's responsibility, actually, to exercise forgiveness one to another. That it wasn't forgiveness that was the prerogative of God, but judgment was the prerogative of God. See, people have the nature that they think that it's their role to judge and God's to forgive. But in fact, it's people's role to forgive and God's to judge. So here the Catholic Church has it as wrong as the rabbis had it. And here's the Pope busy absolving somebody of their sins. The priest performs the role of the Holy Spirit in the world when he forgives sins. The priest is able to convert the bread and the wine into the actual body and blood of Christ by ritual incantation and faith, and this is called transubstantiation. It is a miraculous transformation that only he can perform. So here we are actually saying the priest has a kind of magic power over the host. The Catholics will teach that even an audience with a pope is enough to absolve one of one's sins. However, the power to block others from absolving sins is actually a tool of the enemy, because the Catholics teach that no one else is able to forgive anyone else of sins, only the priests. And so they stop anyone from forgiving anyone else's sins, or if they do forgive those sins, it's not necessarily a binding forgiveness. Only the forgiveness issued by the church is real, in their opinion. Christ's whole ministry is actually about replacing judgment with mercy, as I've just pointed out from the story from John 10. It's also stated in John 2:1 that we should forgive each other's sins. In the story of that cripple, it's not that Christ is identified as God by his power to forgive sins, but that all are given the power to forgive. Where the Jews held that man's task was to uphold that law and judge the mercy was the prerogative of God, Jesus held to the diametrically opposite view that it was man's task to forgive his fellow man, and judgment was the prerogative of God. Jesus taught us not to judge anyone, lest we also be judged. Human judgment is flawed, you see, that's the problem. Transubstantiation, the magical changing of bread and wine from bread and wine to body and blood of Christ, is actually a blasphemy, which makes Christ's body the product of a magical chant. Now let's consider whether the great ten-horned beast emerging from the sea in Revelation 13 could be Vatican Rome. The three great Catholic doctrine writers were Augustine, Aquinas, or Aquinas, some people say, and Anselm. Augustine, like many North African church fathers, was best known for his Greek Platonic view of the world, and he used the metaphysical notion of parallel worlds to explain many of his ideas about the incarnation of Christ and the fall of man. Anselm, for his part, he lived from 1033 through to 1109, where Augustine was around about 400, I think, used Greek arguments to prove the existence of God, and tackled questions like innate sinfulness, sin consciousness and moral culpability, as well as the interaction of divine grace with human will in fallen man. The harshness of the papal church, its beast nature, came largely from one of the teachings of Thomas Aquinas, who lived from 1225 to 1274 AD. And Aquinas in turn imported the ideas of the Greek philosopher Aristotle into Christianity and relied on the Roman exercise of law for Christian discipline. So among these ideas of Aristotle was the death sentence for heretics, a symbiotic relationship between the church and state, and use of state power to enforce discipline in the church. I wouldn't think that any one of these three things was something that Jesus would have endorsed. However, they are part of standard church doctrine, especially if you're Catholic. The idea of eternal torment in hell and an intermediate place of purgatory flowed from another Greek notion borrowed directly into Christianity, namely the natural immortality of the human soul. This is often taken as a given by even Protestants, but the Bible teaches, in fact, that the human soul is by nature mortal, not immortal. It is the great reward of God and the promise of the gospel that immortality will be bestowed upon the saints at the day of judgment and resurrection, when a man's spirit can be permanently infused by the divine life of God. Not all spirits receive this gift of immortality. The wicked that are raised on judgment day are raised for their destruction, and they will not be found to be immortal. However, if one does insist on immortality, one then must insist that the rejected spirits, the souls of the wicked, must go off to an immortal punishment, to a never-ending punishment, because their souls cannot be destroyed even in the fires of hell. One could quickly believe that the little horn of Daniel 7 and the complex beast of Revelation 13 could be papal Rome, as otherwise we have a problem with continuity of empires after imperial Rome. We think of Daniel 7's vision of the four beasts. Well, they definitely continue up to Rome, and then suddenly they are there at the end of the world. And so there's this big gap between the time of Rome and the time of Jesus and Rome at the end of the world. And to somehow account for that continuity, we have to look to a modification of the Roman Empire that is alive to this day, and the Roman Catholic Church would appear to be that modification. So without the papacy, there would be nearly 1600 years of waiting from the fall of Imperial Rome in 476 AD to the appearance of the final Antichrist in this century. Historically, it turns out that 1,000 years of Imperial Rome gave way to about 1,000 years of Papal Rome, and Papal Rome appears to be what is represented in the proud horn of Daniel 7, which emerges from among the other 10 horns on that beast's head. This horn, with its human eyes, tears up 3 of old Rome's 10 tribes before the empire moves its capital to Constantinople. The 10 horns of Daniel's fourth beast, Rome's Western Empire, appear to have been the Franks, the Huns, the Visigoths, the Lombards, the Anglo-Saxons, and we can see that in the diagram on the screen now, the Suevi, Burgundians, Ostrogoths, Heruli, and the Vandals. And the 3 torn up by papal forces were the last 3 in this list, the Ostrogoths, Heruli, and the Vandals. This configuration of 10 central people groups existed from around 351 through 476 AD, when pagan imperial Rome finally fell. But it was Emperor Justinian's decree in 538 AD, given from Constantinople, that the Vatican in Rome should still be considered Europe's chief secular power, that allowed Christian Rome to be reborn in its place. If this identification of the 10 tribes is to be accepted, the spiritual similarities of Rome with each of these predecessor kingdoms can perhaps be detected. As an example, the 10-horned apocalyptic beast has bear's feet, and this represents the papal propensity to trample down its victims like Median kings. kings of Medo-Persia were also deified and declared to be infallible, rather like the Pope. Their laws and decrees could not be retracted, and this feature led to Daniel's trial in the lion's den and obliquely to Esther's saving of her people in Esther 8. Pope Pius IX presented papal infallibility as an official doctrine in 1870, as a weapon for silencing all dissent against all future papal proclamations, while the papacy sought to recover from its near demise in 1798. The beast has the mouth of a lion, which is the Babylonian body part. It was resistance against Nebuchadnezzar's directives that led to the 3 young men being cast into the furnace in Daniel 3. The lion's mouth is the mechanism of state that threatens death to the insubordinate and leads to the persecution of saints who place the directives of God before that of the state. Nebuchadnezzar was a harsh ruler, and a modern police state probably best emulates his style of ruling. The corresponding brutality of the papal church, its beast nature, came largely from the teachings of Thomas Aquinas, 1225 through 1274. Aquinas imported the ideas of Aristotle, who lived around about 350 BC, into Christianity and relied on the Roman exercise of law. It's not biblical law, you'll note, but Roman law. Aquinas believed in the death sentence for heretics and the use of state power to enforce discipline in the church. The great iron teeth of the Roman beast tear everything apart and represent the military threat of the Vatican, which even today colludes with powerful mercenary armies to do its dirty work, no doubt for the right price or for shared goals. The beast's body is that of a leopard, and the leopard represents the Empire of Greece. And this, in the future context, speaks of the centrality of Greek philosophy to Catholic doctrines, and also to the doctrines of the world in general. Daniel's leopard was, in fact, Alexander the Great. And the leopard was also a symbol, incidentally, for ancient Nimrod. That comes from the Greek mispronunciation of Nimrod. They called him Nebrod, which is almost identical to the Greek word for leopard. Augustine, like many North African church fathers, was best known for his Platonic view of the world, Plato being a Greek philosopher. And Augustine used the Greek metaphysical notion of parallel worlds to explain many of his ideas about the incarnation of Christ and the fall of man. Anselm, who was living from 1033 through 1109, also used Greek arguments to prove the existence of God and to discuss sin consciousness, moral culpability, and how divine grace can work in sinful human will. In fact, the Trinity was one of the great works of the theologians educated in Greek cities. Daniel 7 makes the comment that this 4th Roman beast is different from the others, and this may be because the first 3 beasts are Middle Eastern powers, whereas the 4th is essentially a European power, and this 4th beast also has much greater longevity than the others. However, not every army was on Rome's side, and the French Revolution of 1789 saw a casting out of religion, and also of the royal family in France, that marked really the beginning of modern atheism. Soon Napoleon appeared in France, and in 1797 he was determined to exterminate the papal line altogether by stopping any successor from continuing after the death of the ailing Pope Pius VI. His brother, Napoleon's brother in Rome, was asked to ensure the same thing. But when the Pope suddenly recovered, an impatient Bonaparte mounted a coup d'etat, physically deposing the Pope and proclaiming a French Republic in 1798. And this so happened to be exactly 1260 years after the 530 AD founding of the papacy as chief secular power in Europe. And that's quite significant because it seems to correspond day for a year to the 1260 days that we read about the duration of the beast in Revelation 13. Protestants saw the fall of the papacy at this time as a judgment on the whore of Babylon and expected Christ's return very soon thereafter. And with the papacy all but terminated, Catholic damage control was very necessary at the turn of the 19th century. Certain eschatological teachings then began to emanate from the Catholic Church, all deflecting attention away from the Pope as the fallen Antichrist. In 1604, the Jesuit de Alcazar had already put forward the preterist theory, in which he identified Antiochus IV as an Antichrist type, with Nero as the actual Antichrist. If Nero was the actual Antichrist, the Pope could not be that person. Now, futurism had already been circulated for a while by another Jesuit called Francisco Ribera since 1585, and this was explained in Pilgrim sermons around 1600. And that particular theory looked for a singular Antichrist in the future who would only appear in the very last days of the age, meaning the Pope could not be that person either. When evangelical Southern Christianity bought into this theory during America's Holiness movement in 1905, the Scofield Reference Bible was produced and popularized. It's very well known today. Scofield also promoted the Plymouth Brethren teachings of one John Darby, who taught the rapture theory, which we've already talked about. And that rapture theory, when it first circulated, didn't start then. It actually stemmed right back to another Jesuit priest whose name was Manuel de la Cunza y Diaz, and he came from Spain, and this theory actually emerged just after the French Revolution. However, without the continuing force of Bonaparte, and with many of the churches now thinking the Pope may not be the final great Antichrist after all, the papacy quietly re-established itself in the political arena as if it had just recovered from an almost fatal wound. And we do read about a horn, a head of the beast that had recovered from a fatal wound in Revelation 13:3. In Daniel, the image of a boasting little horn appears twice, once in Daniel 7 and again in Daniel 8. In Daniel 7, it appears among the 10 horns of the fourth beast, and appears very Roman, because those 10 horns were the Roman Empire. At least that's what they seem to be in the vision. But the horn in Daniel 7:12, and repeated in Daniel 7:25, is observed to carry on boasting and oppressing the saints for a time, times and half a time, again this 42 months or 3.5 years, until the heavenly court goes into session and casts them into eternal fire. This makes it quite clear that the horn in Daniel 7 is a horn from the end of the world, from something that's still future to us. In Daniel 8, it emerges, however, from among the 4 horns that follow the death of Alexander the Great. Now that's a bit different, whereas in Daniel 7 it emerged from the horns of Rome, and Daniel 8 it emerges from the kingdoms of the broken Greek Empire. So it has all the appearances of being Greek. And most probably it is Antiochus IV. If we compare the 2 accounts of the little horns, we find enough similarities to say they must be the same person. So the angel in each case explains the vision as being for the time of the end. So how are we to reconcile the fact that it seems to come both from Rome and from Greece? The grammar in Daniel 8 may allow, according to Adventists, for the little horn to emerge from one of the 4 winds to which the 4 horns point, rather than from one of the 4 horns of the Greek Empire, in which case it's not necessarily Greek. Well, maybe this is a sleight of hand, but maybe it's right. Now, as it so happens, one of the 4 Greek horns does stand for the Seleucid empire which ruled Israel from around about 190 BC. And this little horn is usually understood by the Jews and others to represent the Seleucid king Antiochus IV, of whom we've spoken much, and the ambiguity is possibly intentional. Perhaps we are to understand that this Greek king Antiochus IV is also, in a sense, an antichrist, and we are to learn from him what the Roman antichrist is going to be like at the end of this age. The deliberate ambiguity would indicate that there is something we must learn from the desecration of the temple carried out by Antiochus that informs us about the desecration at the end of time, and which is carried out by the horn that emerges from amongst the end of the Roman Empire. The horn in Daniel 7:12 continues to boast until the heavenly court goes into session and casts it into eternal fire. Yet there is just a little more time given to the other kingdoms in that vision, and if this horn happens to be the Vatican, it seems that its demise is not fully at the end of time. Perhaps its demise is met as the final great Antichrist comes to power. The same would go for the whole ecumenical community attached to Rome. That whole section of the church would be like the unprepared attendants of the bridegroom. Could the casting from heaven of the great red dragon be the same moment in time as the fall of the Catholic Church? If the beast is the Catholic Church, this could certainly be so. Similarly, if the Prince of Princes of Daniel 8:25 is the Messiah, then the little horn's battle with this prince would be at Armageddon itself. Paul's comment about this little horn, this evil king being broken without a hand, but rather by the brightness of Christ's coming, probably relates to this vision in chapter 8. Both horns in chapters 7 and 8 come to their end at Christ's return, whereas Antiochus IV dies a few years after leaving office, but not because of the Messiah. The story of Antiochus is less eschatological then, and more illustrative. His pride is certainly there, and he changes his name from Epimanes to Epiphanes, meaning revelation of God, and in this way he seems to emulate the proud man of sin that Paul speaks about. In that way then, Antiochus does prefigure the Pope, who, as self-proclaimed Christ on earth, also pretends to be a vision of God. The insistence of Antiochus that Jews adopt the Greek language and culture is not dissimilar to the Catholic inclusion of Greek philosophy into its Christian theology. Curiously, both Antiochus Epiphanes and the papacy came to power with the help of the city of Pergamos. This city, Pergamos, supplied military support to help Antiochus IV to power. And later it supplied priests to Constantine's Rome and the Babylonian title Pontifex Maximus for the Pope. But it also secreted the Babylonian mysteries within the Catholic Church. Jesus, in fact, describes Pergamos as the seat of Satan. It is the appearance of a wicked king in Daniel 11, particularly from verse 36 onwards, that seems to bring it all together. Daniel 12, verses 1 to 3, that seems to relate to the same period as the latter part of chapter 11, and seems to be the continuation of it, locates the reader at the end of time, at the time of Michael's battle with the dragon, the Great Tribulation, and the resurrection of the dead. Backtracking a little bit into chapter 11, it seems that a jump from past to future events occurs at verse 36, or perhaps it could be a little bit earlier. Daniel's prophecy, most forget, is given in Babylon, or modern Iraq, and is not given in Israel. Daniel spends hardly any of his life in Israel. He's taken captive to Babylon and receives his visions there. So when Daniel speaks of the king of the north and the king of the south, we should not be holding Israel as a point of reference, but Iraq. So the king of the north and king of the south are not therefore Syria and Egypt, and are more likely to be either Turkey or Iran in the north. Syria and Turkey both extend across the north end of Iraq, and probably Arabia in the south. The king of the north might be Russia, But Russia in any case stands behind Iran and may well fight any war in the Middle East by sending out Iran on its behalf. A wicked king, after fighting in Arabia, will invade Egypt and Libya. On his return from Egypt, he decides to invade Israel and sets up his camp between Tel Aviv and Jerusalem. It seems very possible that he is an Iranian, but he could also be Turkish. Daniel 11:45 is the last verse in Daniel 11, and ends with the Antichrist sitting in his royal seat near Jerusalem, but only briefly before his demise. Daniel 12:1 just appears to continue the story, but is now at the end of the age. It alludes to the great heavenly battle between the Archangel Michael and the dragon, and speaks of a time of great tribulation, followed by the resurrection of Israel's dead and the end of human mortality. So let's now read the material from Daniel 11:36 right through to Daniel 12:3, assuming it's a straight continuum from one chapter into the other. From 11:36, the king, that is the king of the north, will do as he pleases, exalting himself and claiming to be greater than every god. And that's where Paul gets his claim that he speaks that he is greater than all gods. And he will even blaspheme the God of gods. He will succeed, but only until the time of wrath is completed. For what has been determined will surely take place. Verse 37, he will have no respect for the gods of his ancestors, or for the god loved by women, which presumably is Tammuz, or for any other god, for he will boast that he is greater than them all. So this also is Paul saying he will make him, he will say that he himself is God. Instead of these, he will worship the god of fortresses, a god his ancestors never knew, and lavish on him gold and silver and precious stones and expensive gifts. Claiming this foreign god's help, he will attack the strongest fortresses. He will honor those who submit to him, appointing them to positions of authority and dividing the land among them as their reward. The reference to Tammuz is interesting. Tammuz was borrowed into mystery religions and taken to Rome as Adonis and Bacchus. But he was originally a Sumerian god. He was worshipped throughout the territories now found in Iran and Turkey. This suggests that this king's origins are from one of the old Sumerian territories, and most probably therefore from Iran or Turkey. The new god that he worships is the mysterious god of Mapuzim, which is translated as fortresses. And because I don't think we're supposed to be left in the dark about who or what this is, and because it's a modern god, I'm going to suggest it's the god of fortress builders, that is, of the Freemasons. And the god of the Freemasons is Lucifer. Now we continue. 1140, at the time of the end, the king of the south, which we think could be Arabia, will attack the king of the north. I'm going to suggest it's Iran. The king of the north will storm out with chariots, charioteers, and a vast navy. He will invade various lands and sweep through them like a flood. The fact that this king of the north has a navy further tends to identify the king as either Turkey or Iran. The Saudi attack against Iran will draw on old enmities. Even though they're both Muslim nations, they're not friendly brothers. One of the nations happens to be Shiite and the other is Sunni. The Saudi attack will probably be at America's behest to give the United States a way to assess Iranian strength before coming to the task themselves. But Iran may follow Adolf Hitler's blitzkrieg approach to this war, using a multitude of tanks and warships and heading west. Will quickly subdue most of the Middle East, presumably central Saudi Arabia included. His trajectory will take him straight into northern Israel. Those in the south will get a chance to escape, but they must be quick, as he turns immediately southward and subdues Egypt and crosses borders to threaten Libya and Ethiopia. His ships will attack Egypt from the Red Sea. However, he may also have ships that are in the Mediterranean. It's quite possible. He will enter the glorious land, verse 41 of chapter 11, of Israel, and many nations will fall, but Moab, Edom, and the best part of Ammon will escape, and these are in the southeastern part of Israel. He will conquer many countries, and even Egypt will not escape. He will gain control over the gold, silver, and treasures of Egypt, and the Libyans and Ethiopians will be his servants. Notice that the southeastern area is where the people are counted to escape to, which means he must come sweeping into Israel from more or less the northern quarters. His initial campaign will probably take a year, just based on the wars as we see them today, and there may even be another year or two of consolidation before what seems like an American response gets underway to deal with his invasion of Israel and Saudi Arabia. Unless, of course, America finds itself disabled at this critical time, which something like a Russian attack might affect. Of course, Europe could also be involved with defending Israel, but by this time, of course, the Europeans may have become disaffected with Israel. Oh, I should point out, I've noticed there that something seems to detain him near Tel Aviv where he camps. He does not seem to want to return back to Iran, but seems to get stuck in Israel. So there is an immediate threat against his own land, Iran, which lies to the east, and he considers how to defend that land. He rallies his troops and hurries back towards Iran, stopping in Israel near Tel Aviv, but then something seems to detain him there. Could that something perhaps be a cosmic event? Jesus speaks of the powers of heaven being moved at about this time. On the way there, this evil king obliterates many, using perhaps small nuclear devices. He sets up his camp in Israel, where it appears he will stay for some 3.5 years. For some reason, perhaps the second coming, he will never make it back to his home. European and American forces may have formed a military alliance against Iran by this time, which is probably well into the 3rd year since the war began. In Daniel 11:36, it refers to his final demise once the time of wrath is complete. And we can connect this perhaps to the vials of wrath that are seen in Revelations 15 and 16. If we assume this time to be completed at the end of the Great Tribulation, then his demise comes with the return of Jesus Christ, as Paul also seems to believe. The next event in Daniel's account is Michael taking up arms in heaven. It is the standing up of Michael at Daniel 12:1, corresponding to Michael's campaign in heaven against the dragon, that marks the beginning of the final 3.5 years of history and the appearance of the final Antichrist. For consistency, we must assume that this verse does not describe action after the demise of the evil king at Daniel 11:45, but is in a sense a recap of that period, which will therefore have lasted for 3.5 years. And in Daniel 12:1 it continues, at that time Michael, the archangel, stands guard over your nation, that's Israel, will arise. Then there will be a time of anguish greater than any since nations first came into existence. And Jesus quotes us when he says there should come a time of trouble such as never was since the world began. But at that time, every one of your people whose name is written in the book, presumably the book of life, will be rescued, or perhaps the book of the covenant. This time of unprecedented trouble, a time of anguish greater than ever before, is surely the Great Tribulation. The rescue here that Daniel speaks of in 12:1 is not yet the resurrection, but its deliverance from the grip of the terrible oppressor who has now come into Jerusalem. It is the woman carried away to a place of safety in the desert by the wings of a giant eagle at Revelation 12. That giant eagle is God himself, carrying his own people to safety. But at the end of the tribulation comes the second coming and the general resurrection of the dead. To put it back in Daniel 12's words, many of those whose bodies lie dead and buried will arise, some to everlasting life, and some to shame and everlasting disgrace. Those who are wise will shine as bright as the sky, and those who lead many to righteousness will shine like the stars forever. Now, at Daniel 12:11, the angel summarizes by telling Daniel that these events pertain to the end of time. and that a period of 1290 days accounts for the temple's desecration during the Great Tribulation, while there's a period of 1335 days that will see the saints receive their glorious inheritance. Judgment apparently continues, it seems if we use our basic maths, for about 45 days, not so different from the 40 days of judgment that occurred during Noah's flood. While the angel has referred to the desecration, he has not referred to the desecrator in his summary, and he's left that still as a mystery. In Revelation 13, John sees the terrible first apocalyptic beast rise from the sea. There's nothing in this passage that actually says specifically that Israel is invaded by the beast. We just see him standing there outside Israel. The beast stands for the fact that with the dragon now thrown from heaven, a terrible spirit of apostasy has taken hold of the world. The sea is also a sea of political chaos, and there is no respect for the things or people of God. It is a spirit of Antichrist. Jerusalem falls at this time because Israel is hated, and Christians are hated for their identification with the Jewish Saviour, Jesus Christ. The Islamic seed of Abraham's other wives, Hagar and Keturah, hate the Christians because they believe that they, the Muslims, should have the covenant relationship with Abraham that the Christians believe they instead have received through relationship with Jesus Christ. In Daniel 9:27, we know only that the temple lays desolate until the day of judgment, the consummation, and that the reason for this is the overspreading of apparently Jewish abominations. Possibly these abominations are the new animal sacrifices that the Jews will begin carrying out once the temple is rebuilt and rededicated in or near Jerusalem. The desecrator who enters the land and unleashes his terrifying persecution is merely a tool in Christ's hand, pushing Israel one last time towards faith in Christ. The desecrator does not know that he is but a tool, and he makes his plans based on his own occult aspirations, thinking he is in full control. Because of the role he has to play, God will, for a time, give him great success. And here we have a picture of Moses beating the golden calf down that the Israelites have meantime made. Now, the date of the Jerusalem desecration may be chosen to suit occult objectives, so it could possibly be in early September. If the desolator's term of rule ends on a Passover, it must begin 3 years and 7 months, that is 1290 days earlier, which would be in the month of September. In occult circles, the month of Av, our August-September, is the holy month of the Celtic sun god and of Lush, the Freemasonic master craftsman. It was in the same month that the Israelites created the golden calf, and this was also the month that the Jesuits founded their order in the crypt of Saint Denis in 1534. Denis, by the way, is a French variation of Dionysus, a god of drunkenness and fornication, but also a god of bloodlust and the severed head. Albert Pike wrote his famous letter to Mazzini in this month, outlining his plans for 3 future world wars, and the darkest days of the month are the 9th to the 11th of Av. And we know, of course, many tragic events have happened on the 11th of September, historically, not least the downing of the 2 Twin Towers. It was always in this month that the great sign of the moon rising under Virgo's feet occurs. And it was on the 9th of Av, again the more or less the 12th of, in this case the 12th of September, that the Jerusalem temple was twice destroyed. I just mentioned the Twin Tower attack was on the 11th September in 2001. Now, if all of this is correct, the final desolator in Jerusalem will be an Iranian. Iran was the original lion of Babylon, and it seems that a Babylonian army and a Babylonian religion will be ruling the Middle East and the world in its final days. The world that Christ judges will in every way, it seems, have become a reincarnation of Babylon the Great. The final microcosm must reflect the historical macrocosm. The future Antichrist, as a Muslim, will certainly emulate all historical Antichrists. Islam is clearly also then one of the 7 heads of the apocalyptic beast that stands in the sea of the human chaos. On this subject of Islam and its possible links to Catholicism, we have 2 popular streams of understanding, and the truth is probably somehow shared between the 2. The most popular alternative media approach has been the Chick Comics testimony of ex-Jesuit Alberto Rivera, who died a couple of decades ago of suspicious food poisoning. He claimed that the Jesuit college at the Vatican taught him that Rome had basically brought Islam into being. To supply Arabia with a Rome-friendly prophet and to muster an army in the Middle East that could easily cross into Israel when needed to overthrow Jerusalem for the Vatican and to make it a papal capital. This is believable because the grooming of Muhammad would have taken place in the late 500s, which is also when the Pope received universal secular power in Europe. The need for a Rome-friendly prophet in Arabia was probably important because Arabian Christianity was still largely Arian in the 6th century and the doctrines of Rome were largely being rejected. In Rivera's tale, the good fortunes of Muhammad's family gave them a great name in Mecca, and when Muhammad later cleared away the pagan idols from Mecca and dedicated the Kaaba to his new religion, his actions were tolerated and even applauded because of his family's status. The battle for Mecca was one of 3 that Muhammad fought personally, but his followers took their swords after him to northern Africa, and in AD 711, with the help of mercenaries and some of the wages supplied by Rome, the Muslim armies crossed the Mediterranean to Spain and met with tremendous success. This was now after Muhammad's death, which occurred in AD 632. Now, the Pope was okay with this as long as it didn't encroach upon Italy or progress any further, but he also summoned Muhammad's armies to Palestine, which they subsequently conquered. The Muslim armies took Jerusalem, but the double cross came in when the now powerful Muslims refused to hand Jerusalem to the Pope, which had apparently been the price to pay for Rome's investment in Islam's military successes. Rivera's account claims that Rome also allowed Muhammad's armies to conquer in Arabia, but they were to spare Catholic worshippers. But this is where Rivera's story has some inconsistencies, which can only be explained if Muhammad twice double-crossed Rome and had no true empathy with the Roman Church at all. Rivera's account paints Muhammad as Rome's golden boy, receiving all his needs while being taught in Augustinian monasteries. Rome had him learn about politics in the court of Catholic King Negus of Ethiopia and Egypt. Even Muhammad's wife Khadija, who came from a family of Jewish converts to Catholicism, was plucked from a monastery and given to Muhammad to be his wife and spiritual mentor. In more recent times, a Muslim convert to Christianity, Walid Shubert, has been making a living as a speaker in Christian conventions, where he educates Christians about the true nature of Islam and what he believes is its very real threat to Western Christendom. Among his published articles is one that attempts to rubbish Rivera's story for inconsistencies between Islamic injunctions in the Quran and Rivera's claims about the Catholic mandate for Muhammad. Of course, Rivera cannot now defend himself against Schubert because he has died before Schubert began his speaking tours. But Schubert believes that Surah 9 shows Muhammad ordering his followers to spare the sectarian non-Trinitarians who had been driven to the monasteries, but to kill the Catholic monks who lived there. This depicts Muhammad as strongly anti-Catholic, and seems at odds with the idea that Islam actually was founded by the Catholics. Well, it may be the case that he was at first a Christian believer of a more Arian persuasion, and he may have thrown off his Catholic teachings for a more Arabian and Arian point of view. In the end, however, he was rejected by both the Arians and the Catholics, after which he appears to have expanded his prophetic writings into the larger corpus of the Quran, and to have instructed his followers to carry forth its revisionist message after his death. However, Schubert is never going to, like the Catholics, create Islam's story anyway, simply because he himself is the son of a marriage between a Muslim father and a Catholic mother, and his wife is also a Catholic. He believes the Catholic doctrine entirely and defends the Catholic version of history as strongly as he decries Islam. So his views are not really as neutral as they probably need to be. Schubert also extols the Trinity and essentially condemns Muhammad as just another kind of Arian heretic. This does not explain, however, how Islam arrived at the Muslim extremity that God has no son at all, which also stands in conflict with biblical statements. Even by Islamic admission, Christ came into the world by virgin birth, which is quite a surprising admission, and they will accept that he is created by God. But the distinction lies with the refusal to accept the creedal statement that Jesus is begotten of God, as a man might beget a son. They do not seem to consider that the Nicene Creed could mean that Christ is begotten of the Spirit and not of the flesh. Denial of Christ's sonship of God is not really Arianism, but is in fact the doctrine of Antichrist. Christ may, even by Islamic admission, have come into the world by virgin birth, but this is still considered to be different from God begetting a son. Where the Nicene Creed held that Christ was begotten, not made, Islam countered with made, not begotten. But Arianism in these terms says made and begotten. Walid Schubert would, in fact, be an ideal tool for the CIA, who would probably pay him well to give some of these speeches, as his speeches successfully stir up anti-Muslim feelings in the United States and will unwittingly help to precipitate the great social division that the Illuminists hope will spark a continuing Zionist Islamic war everywhere. They want this strife to escalate in all countries until it produces what they call the Third World War. Their political workings will probably have a lot to do with who turns up in Jerusalem's temple, a character that some occultists darkly refer to as Sargon III, a new Assyrian emperor. It all goes back to the Vatican and the Jesuits. This is where the microcosm will reflect the macrocosm. But we need to take a quick look at Daniel 2 first before we go further. And here in the picture we have the last part of Daniel's vision being displayed. The statue seen by King Nebuchadnezzar is the history of the empires of the Mediterranean world down to the Messiah. Messiah comes as a rock from heaven and causes the statue to disintegrate and blow away in the wind. The heaven-sent rock strikes the statue at its feet, and this is where we are now, in those feet. The feet, if we look now at the picture before we write words over it, you can see is mixed with metal and clay. The feet are a bit odd, and Daniel is curious about the fact that there appears to be a lot of clay mixed in with the iron feet. The clay is only in the feet, and the feet represent the makeup of Europe under papal ascendancy. But no sooner does papal Rome begin its power plays than Islam also appears on the scene. Clearly then, the Jesuit-run iron of Europe is mired in clay, which appears to be Islam. But Islam does not overcome Europe. It is iron and clay together that control the world at the end of time. But we will study this more when we come to the Illuminati and Freemason in later studies. That's still several studies down our list. Note for now that the word Arab is the Hebrew word for mixed. The Arabians are in reality a mixture of peoples. Ignoring the option that they who mix themselves with the seed of men in Daniel 2 are aliens, the seed of men with whom the iron peoples mix are not the usual Anashim people, but a lowlier Anash, which indicates a weakened and more obscure mass of humanity. Mixture came to Europe and the Americas through the importation of slaves from mainly Muslim lands. And another meaning of Arab is trafficked. Many Muslims were indeed taken to Europe as slaves. Others in Europe still look Arab because they were the freeborn offspring of Arab invaders. This started from as early as the Crusades, when both sides, in fact, raped their female victims, and when migrations took place to consolidate one territory. Countries like Spain, Sicily, Turkey, and areas of the Balkans all have skin colours that betray their Arab past. And Mexico and Central America received both mass Spanish immigration and trafficked slaves at different times, and reflect the darkened skins of subsequent intermarriage. Dark-skinned Arab communities remain in India, China, and some of the southern Russian states. Indeed, there is a third meaning of Arab, and that is darkened. The Hebrew word Arab, or Arab, is sister to the word Erev, which means evening. An evening in Hebrew describes the way the colour of the sky is darkened as the light of day mixes with the darkness of the night, and once also denoted the dawn. Indeed, the word evening in the Genesis text probably started life as the word dawned. Thus, it dawned the morning of the first day and so forth, instead of it was evening and morning of the first day. And that, of course, would change the way we understand the Genesis story. The angel repeats 4 times in Daniel 2 that the shiny iron does not naturally mix with the darkness of the clay, which is surely emphatic. 4 is also the number of civilization, and civilization is also in an unnatural mix at the end of days. The mixture also probably indicates that these distinct peoples, the iron and clay groups, have fundamentally different religious and ethnic backgrounds, and all of this is consistent with the flow of Arab peoples throughout the Western European countries, which we're witnessing very much in our own day. But is it possible that Papal Rome and Islam could conspire to overthrow Israel? Does Rome incite Iran to overrun the Middle East? Or does Rome incite Saudi Arabia instead, still a Muslim country, but it all goes wrong when Iran fights back and conquers Saudi? In Revelation 13, we discover the function of the second beast, which is to cause men to worship the first beast, which is the entity that had a miraculous recovery from what looks like certain death. That entity we saw before was Papal Rome, which died politically in 1798, but which slowly came back to life in the next century. Of the second beast we read, he exercises all the power of the first beast before him, and causes the earth and them that dwell therein to worship the first beast, whose deadly wound had been healed. Revelation 13:12. In the generalized microcosm that is the apocalypse, the first beast arises fully empowered from the sea of nations, while the second beast arises within the land, which ordinarily would have been Israel. Satan in this combination will be manifest at full power, and it may be worth considering what the most powerful political configuration available today would look like. In today's world, the strongest alliance possible would probably be the United States in cohorts with the Vatican. This would merge the world's presumably most advanced military force with the CIA-like powers of the Jesuits, along with the Jesuit access to the world's various mystery schools, lodges, and governments. This, with the NSA home-based intelligence gained from cameras, wiretapping, and online monitoring, would produce an almost inescapable intelligence system. Decrees of the United States supported by the Vatican would be universal to all but the communists, and even the communists would be on side if America were adopting the socialism of the New World Order and Agenda 21. In our studies of the New World Order, we will see that Agenda 21 is already taking America swiftly down that path, although President Trump may have plans to dismember this agenda before the end of his first term. This may seem like an unnatural marriage, but collusion between the Vatican and America was already strong in the Reagan years. Rome already uses the CIA and the lodges to exert some control over radical Islam in its activities, not least pressing the go buttons when it wants some attack in a major city. Each attack brings new support for totalitarian controls in the victimized countries, advancing the surrender of civilian rights. This is happening in most of the Western nations. The Muslims are merely a tool to get these measures into place. Funds to arm jihad and stage these attacks are also commonly moved through Vatican banks by the CIA. And there is a clandestine sort of cooperation between the Vatican, the World Bank, the American CIA, and the Illuminist forces. The Jesuits, up to 2016, were using United States intelligence agencies and the United States military to overthrow countries that seemed to be resisting assimilation into the New World Order. Many of these countries are Muslim, waiting instead for an Islamic caliphate. The Americans therefore serve the New World Order by conquering these countries and get to plunder their gold and reserves as part of the deal. They cause the Muslims to hate Christians and seek revenge. And as the terrorists strike back at innocent civilians, the Congress is able to advance ever more money to fight on more fronts in more Muslim lands. Trump's current travel ban list of Muslim countries is probably a good list of where America intends to finance its future wars. The fact is, the wars we see already were all drawn on a list nearly 30 years ago. And after Syria and Yemen, Somalia and Sudan are next on the list, perhaps also Chad and finally Iran. Venezuela is another on that same list, but is being taken care of already through inciting popular revolution. However, with current Turkish aspirations to form an alliance with Iran and North Korea's testing of missiles for Iran, American action against Iran may be pushed a little further up the list. In fact, if we look at it now, the way North Korea is turning away from its testing and trying to talk peace with South Korea, this may well be because America has identified what Iran is doing through North Korea, and by turning its sights on Iran, it may have said to North Korea, if you want to be part of what's going to happen to Iran, you continue what you're doing, but if you want to have peace in your country, stop assisting the Iranians. I think North Korea may be thinking that it's not worth the trouble. To shock Americans and Europeans into consenting to these wars, the Jesuits in America also get help from Middle Eastern powers like Israel and Saudi Arabia, who court American favor because they feel nervous about their militant Arab neighbors. Yemen, for instance, is being bombed by Saudi Arabia, ostensibly to break the hold of the Houthi rebels, and the Iranians have influence there through the Houthis. Lebanon is also seen as being under Iranian control, as are the Palestinians in Israel. Iran is the last domino to fall in the long list. Israel, later on, will be involved in US efforts against Iran. But just now they are all involved in the training and funding of Islamic extremists such as the Sunni groups Al-Qaeda and ISIS. As someone said tongue-in-cheek, ISIS doesn't mean Islamic State in Iraq and Syria, but Israeli Secret Intelligence Service. Afterwards, the media shortened the name to IS for Islamic State. The media has very recently changed it again now to Daesh, which is the movement's own acronym for itself. The Jesuits and CIA incite these nihilists to bring fear and chaos to Western cities they want to take control of. You'll have noticed that a lot of these attacks are in places like London or Paris. And these attacks also have occurred in Muslim lands. These attacks also occur in Muslim lands, and the CIA use these to destroy non-Catholic churches and kill Christians for being somehow to blame for America's foreign policies. Any dead non-Catholic is still a gain for the Jesuit puppet masters. The instigators view the slaughter of Christians as collateral damage, and useful collateral damage at that, as it horrifies Christians back home and stops them from protesting against the inhuman policies of their own governments, who also fight the terrorists in their own lands. Instead, the Christians will sign up like donkeys to fight the Muslim terror overseas. The tactics used by the Vatican and CIA are simply the Hegelian dialectic. Set two of your enemies at each other's throats and enthusiastically urge each side on. When all is finished, no merit will be attributed to either side, but instead both Islam and Christianity will be outlawed as the New World religion is ushered in, with the Catholics still in control. We'll talk about this in later talks, but in simple terms, it is just the Inquisition continuing in the modern day. This is also just Albert Pike 101, and he has simply espoused methods that have always seemed to work historically. But the Vatican and CIA need to be careful. The Illuminati intends to overthrow them as well, unless the Vatican crosses over to Lucifer worship and America becomes subservient to the New World Order and Agenda 21. Judaism and Protestantism, particularly, will need to watch their backs. Although they will have largely financed the great plan of the Illuminists, they will soon afterwards discover themselves to be the new heretics, the remnant of old religious cultures that lay at the heart of all the problems of the past and all the wars just fought. The New World Order is nothing but fascism reborn. Of course, this subterfuge all costs money, and selling indulgences is no longer an option in the modern world. Indulgences, by the way, were the issue that caused Martin Luther to protest against the Catholic Church in his day. They were just a great fundraiser for church building. But in the modern day, wars also need money to be fought. The money needed is not just to train terrorists and pay off politicians, but also to develop space technology, sustain off-world colonies, and build huge underground complexes, where the elitists plan to sit it out if their surface war happily gets out of control. The necessary money all comes from various forms of embezzlement of public money, stolen gold, and drug sales. The United States forced the Chinese government of a century ago to accept bonds in exchange for nearly $17 trillion worth of gold. But after first refusing to recognize the Chinese bonds in the modern day, it is now saying it has no gold left to give the Chinese in any case. A quantity that was nevertheless earmarked for China in 2001 was moved to the basements of the Twin Towers, ready for loading onto ships. But this was caught, it's alleged, in the 9/11 attack, and the gold disappeared to an unknown destination. While the Americans claim not to know where it went, they really smuggled it to South America to fund military projects for space. A great deal of Libyan gold was also stolen, while the CIA helped the civil rebellion throw out Gaddafi in Libya. Ex-President Obama was also recently indicted for a drug haul on a Caribbean ship, ironically named the Lady Michelle, and spent some time in Japan answering questions, but this was kept from the press. They instead promoted his time with Angela Merkel, where he attended a climate control conference. It's not clear whether he did both at once, in which case he must have a double. However, a swath of charges currently being arrayed by the Trump regime against Obama may soon see his character and destructive mission destroyed. Trump was, Obama, by the way, was also recently asked to explain his falsified university records and identity papers, and these are ongoing issues. He also had illegal contributions from a charity. There are various tax queries about his income, and years before he also illegally claimed benefits in several states at once, so he was a benefit cheater. But all of this was swept under the carpet when he came to power because he was so popular. More recently, Trump is also lining him up for charges in illegal spy tapping. Obama used illegal spy tapping charges in foreign embassies, including Germany and also in the US. And now it transpires that Obama was also basically busy with infiltrating the Trump election campaign well before the time of the actual election, and illegally using state powers to do so. It transpires also, as Trump came to power and looked at the accounts, that Obama's wife, shall we call her, Michelle, spent $12 million to keep her entourage busy in the White House on her behalf in those 8 years. And this is so excessive that Trump has actually sued the Obamas for $12 million to be returned. In the Caribbean also, the yacht on which Obama's wife and children were holidaying was seized when it stopped in Jamaica by officials. This is part of the asset seize that Trump launched against those suspected of being involved in international money laundering and drug and sex trafficking crimes. So the seizing of Obama's property suggests that he may also be linked to the sex trafficking rings as well. Now, he made tremendous financial gifts to some countries overseas, and we're hearing about this all the time as gifts to Iran, particularly. And some of that went to the Palestinian Liberation, well, Hamas they call it now, and so-called to ask as a gift to these people if they agreed to stick by the agreements made with Europe, but they never did stick with those agreements, and it's a good question as to whether Obama ever thought they would, but he nevertheless gave them billions of dollars, in fact hundreds of billions of dollars, to conform to international standards. The CIA, of course, is not very squeaky clean either. They were serving the Obama cause. Certainly they were complicit in transporting drugs and weapons all over the world. They were caught out earlier in 2017 when a plane headed for Guantanamo Bay crashed and spilled some 35 tons of Afghan cocaine over the forest floor. This was destined to be sold by CIA-controlled mafia in America to fund still more operations. Creating money in this way keeps the operations out of the books and hidden from official audits. In broader terms, as Jesuit power continues to grow, they will need ways to influence the money supply of every country. And one way that they've managed to do this is to place their banks in every conquered country and to make these banks the preferred banks for handling foreign exchange transactions. Now, the Jesuits will not use the Vatican Bank because that would be too obvious. They tend to use the banks of another Illuminati champion, Lord Rothschild, instead. So they place these Rothschild banks in all the countries they conquered. Afghanistan, Iraq, and Libya all got Rothschild central banks after the Americans had been there. These banks extend loans for the rebuilding of the invaded countries as well, and from the outset start to gain control of those countries financially. See, in this way, unchecked, they take countries by stealth, secretly gaining the respect of the governments. They can also help politically, especially as countries recover from the disasters that the Americans have brought upon them. There seems to be no doubt that a Catholic-American alliance is all too possible and will probably protect the West against nearly anything except a nuclear attack. It is for this reason that Putin, who seems to hate the New World Order because of the influence of the Jesuits and Americans, would probably not hesitate to initiate a nuclear strike against America once Trump has finished his term. While Trump is sharing Putin's goal of undoing the New World Order at the moment, war will not develop between the two great powers. But if Trump's opponents finally come back to power, say in 2025, and if Putin or his successor gets a good enough chance, and especially if China will side with him, as China in fact does have a bone to pick with the Americans, a nuclear attack on the US is very possible, and one might think even probable. Finally, to conclude this long diversion in our study, we bring ourselves back to Revelation 13 and its two beasts. The beast with the 10 horns is a political entity in the last days that incorporates both ancient and modern Middle Eastern and European powers in its horns and heads. An apocalyptic generalization allows us to say that such powers have grown sufficiently to control the whole world. The spirit behind the first beast is the spirit of Satan himself. It is an angry and authoritarian spirit that defies the God of heaven and is apostasy itself. The chief last days power in this conglomeration is probably the United States, but it will no doubt officially exercise its power under the legalizing umbrella of the United Nations. presuming that that entity still exists after the Trump regime, but it will be something equivalent to that. The second beast has all the appearances of a peaceful empire, but with the words of an antichrist. It looks from its two horns like a lamb, but it speaks like a dragon. It hates Israel and it hates Christians. This second beast operates in the capacity of a priesthood serving the first beast, like the Egyptian magicians who represented Pharaoh. It has power to perform false miracles. It draws fire from heaven like Elijah, but it's false fire. It causes men to worship the first beast, which is the world state. In each empire, it has a different dominant form. The fact that it is shown with two small horns indicates a religious entity seated in two great families. Abraham's other two wives, Hagar and Keturah, are probably indicated, as these were the original mothers of the Arab nations. The children of Esau have also chosen their part with the Arabs instead of with Israel, as did the children Moab and Ammon of Abraham's cousin Lot. And then there are all the nations the Muslims have converted from North Africa right through to southern Russia. These will all ally themselves with the Antichrist in a huge alliance against Jew and Christian. The necessary hatred lies with the Muslim countries. The Bible describes a confederation coming against Israel, which is usually understood by expositors as denoting Russia, but could just as easily be Islamic. Indeed, it seems more in keeping with observed history and the ancient enmity between the brothers, the sons of Abraham, that the confederation should be Islamic. Now, I don't know if you want to follow or read Nostradamus or not, and I probably wouldn't recommend it as a rule, but I do remember from the days that I was trying to translate his quatrains that there is a famous prophecy of his about a third great Antichrist, who he referred to as the man of the blue turban. Now, he doesn't say it's Antichrist and blue turban in the same passage, but if you read several together, it seems to be the case. And the name of this man was Mabus. It was Stan Deo who sparked my interest recently with the fact that the new crown prince in Saudi Arabia and the new chief of their armed forces is Mohammed bin Salman, who is often just known by his initials MBS. Could this be who Nostradamus had in mind as a third Antichrist? MBS is young and fabulously wealthy already, and is a popular leader. He is also something of a humanist. He buys into Agenda 21 and all of the New World Order programs. But if he is that king of the south that attacks Iran, he is going to come off second best because of it, and he cannot then be the man of sin who sits in Jerusalem. He may instead play a significant role in bringing about the Third World War in the Middle East, and this may be the meaning of Nostradamus' prophecy in any case. Nostradamus claims that Mabus will soon be gone, and after his departure will come a great undoing of mankind. In fact, if that undoing of mankind is at the hands of the man of sin, then Mabus is in a sense a precursor to him. It is also true that the man of sin in Daniel, that he will utterly make away many, and we should add the thought that it may be at this time that Russia also attacks America. Having the Jews and Arabs in a state of slow recovery after the decimations of ferocious Middle Eastern wars, the Illuminists will be able to launch the last stage of their takeover, which is to set in place a new world order. The cleanup, as they set this up, will include a program of eradicating Jews and Christians around the world. They will probably ask the ruler in Jerusalem to place some sort of contemptuous image of some sort in the temple precincts. It may be that the statue of a Moabite god Hubal is placed there, which once stood in the Kaaba. That god, that deity, that idol, Hubal, his name means the spirit of Baal, and this was worshipped in the form of a man. Because Islamic beliefs prohibit any depiction of Allah or even of Muhammad, the image will have to be a generic representation of man, or perhaps the image of an angel, in which case it could even be of Lucifer himself, who Albert Pike stated must be brought out into public view when the final transition takes place. Lucifer, in any case, is certainly symbolized in the image of Hubal. But Paul makes the interesting comment that this character will be so proud as to present himself as a living God. And this draws us back yet again to the possibility that the one who will sit in Jerusalem's new temple will be the Pope. And that's it for this third study, and that brings to an end for now our reference to the desolating abomination. And we move on next week to another topic which I'm sure will interest you greatly. Until then, I wish you all a fantastic week, and I do truly hope to see you all again next week. Until then, bye.